Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome to another spine-chilling episode of our scary stories. I'm your host, and tonight I invite you to descend with me into the dark corridors of human desire. You see, our desires are mirrors that reflect not just what we want, but what we fear. Tonight's tale takes us to a quaint, yet unnerving little town where one woman's curiosity turns into an agonizing quest for salvation. So dim the lights, pull your blanket a little tighter, and prepare yourself as we delve into the haunting narrative of the Soul Collector. The bell above the door jingled a soft, discordant melody as Anne stepped into the cluttered space of the antique store. She felt the immediate embrace of the room's musty aroma, a blend of aged wood, leather, and the kind of oldness that doesn't have a name. The air was thick and nearly tangible, like wading through a past long forgotten. A labyrinth of shadowy corners and dusty shelves met her gaze, each cluttered with relics that looked as if they'd been untouched for decades, perhaps even centuries. This small, antiquated haven nestled on the outskirts of a quaint yet somber town was her secret sanctuary. And yet today, something felt different. An air of quiet dread mingled with the familiar scent of antiquity. It seemed to Anne that the room itself held its breath, as if expecting something, or someone. "Ah, Anne, my dear, back again," crooned Ms. Morden, emerging from behind a beaded curtain that separated the front from what Anne presumed was a labyrinthine back room. The elderly woman was the epitome of ageless enigma, swathed in layers of flowing garments, adorned with trinkets and amulets that jingled softly as she moved. "Yes," Anne replied, forcing a smile. "I can't seem to stay away. Your shop has a particular allure, you know." Ms. Morden's eyes twinkled like the countless gems that surrounded her. "Oh, I do know, my dear. Each object here calls to someone, eventually." It was then that Anne felt it, a pull. Subtle at first, as if a gentle hand guided her gaze. Her eyes met a glass display case, and within it lay an amulet unlike any she had seen before. The pendant was a swirling, dark obsidian framed by intricate silver filigree. It looked almost like a frozen vortex, a contained storm that beckoned her closer. "That's an intriguing piece, isn't it?" Ms. Morden appeared beside Anne so silently, it startled her. "Would you like to hold it?" Anne hesitated. "It's beautiful, but it almost seems ominous." "All powerful things have their own shadow," Ms. Morden mused, unlocking the glass case. "Balance is the essence of our world. Pleasure and pain, love and loss. They're bound together as tightly as flesh to bone." With a mixture of reluctance and anticipation, Anne reached into the case and touched the amulet. The moment her skin met the cool obsidian, a shiver tore through her, electrifying and unsettling. It was as though a voice she couldn't hear was whispering secrets into her very soul. "How much is it?" Anne found herself asking, although a part of her screamed to place it back, to turn around, and to leave. "For you, my dear," Ms. Morden said with an unreadable smile. "Let's call it a favor for a favor. You'll find its value far exceeds the price of mere currency." Anne's heart pounded. She was at the edge of a precipice, looking down into an abyss of unknown depth. Her mind told her to retreat, but the pull of the amulet was stronger. With a barely audible murmur of agreement, she found herself accepting the velvet box Ms. Morden offered, where the amulet lay like a sleeping dragon. "Ah, destiny has woven its thread, hasn't it?" Ms. Morden closed the case and handed it to Anne, her fingers lingering on the box as if she were bestowing a grave blessing. Or perhaps a curse. Anne clutched her newly acquired possession, still wrapped in a fog of fascination and foreboding. She took her leave, each step feeling heavier than the last. Ms. Morden stood at the threshold, watching her disappear into the encroaching twilight. "May it bring you what you seek," she whispered, but the words were tinged with a sorrow that drenched the air, making the room feel colder than before. As the door closed behind Anne, the bell rang out once more, echoing like a mournful sigh through the store's labyrinth of forgotten history. But for the first time, the sound seemed to carry a soft, almost imperceptible undertone, a whisper of thanks, or perhaps of warning. It was as though the room could finally exhale, releasing a secret it had held for far too long. And in that moment, Anne felt the weight of her decision settle deep within her bones, like a story that had just begun to unfold its darkest chapters. Anne stepped into the welcoming embrace of her home, her personal sanctuary from the world outside. The soft glow of the table lamp cast warm shadows on the walls, filling the air with a golden hue that danced upon well-worn bookshelves and framed family photos. But tonight, her usually comforting abode seemed to resist her presence, as if warning her of a malevolent guest she'd unwittingly invited. Mark, her husband, glanced up from a tangle of documents and blueprints on the dining table. "Hey, you're back late. Find anything interesting?" His voice was a calm harbor in the brewing storm of her thoughts. "Yes, but I'm not quite sure what it is yet," Anne responded, glancing at the velvet box still in her hand. "Why don't you unwind a bit?" Mark suggested. "I've got some more work to finish up here. Then we can have dinner." "Sounds like a plan," Anne said, forcing a smile as she made her way to her study, a small but cozy room lined with towering bookshelves and scattered notes from her own research on various curiosities and lore. The study had always been her private oasis, a realm where mysteries unfolded under her keen scrutiny. However, as she sat down at her wooden desk, her gaze fell upon the velvet box she had placed there. It sat silently, almost innocently, and yet she felt its silent call, a near-audible whisper that urged her to open the box. Unable to resist, she lifted the lid, and there it was, the amulet, as mesmerizing and inscrutable as when she'd first laid eyes on it. With a sense of quiet determination, Anne opened her laptop to begin her investigation. Keying in search terms and combing through articles and databases of ancient artifacts, she found no trace of an amulet matching its description. It was as though the relic existed in a world separate from documented history. Frustrated and somewhat relieved, Anne leaned back in her chair. "I wish I could figure you out," she mumbled, eyeing the amulet. "Better yet, I wish my boss would just go away and give me time to think." Sighing, she closed her laptop, enveloped the amulet back into its velvet cocoon, and turned off the light, hoping to leave behind the oppressive enigma it represented. As Anne slipped into the warm bed beside Mark, the worries of the day seemed to drift away, succumbing to the fog of approaching sleep. But even as she closed her eyes, she felt an uneasy shiver crawl up her spine, as if an invisible hand had brushed against her very soul. Morning broke with the sharp ring of Anne's phone. Groggily, she reached for it, half expecting a call from work, demanding she come in for an emergency meeting. Instead, it was Michelle, her work colleague. "Anne, have you heard?" "Heard what?" Anne mumbled, still awash in the haze of sleep. "It's Mr. Thompson, our boss. He's dead. They found him in his apartment. The circumstances are all very strange." A jolt of icy fear surged through Anne's body, snapping her into full wakefulness. "What? How?" "They don't know yet. Police are investigating, but it looks sudden, inexplicable even." "Thanks for letting me know," Anne said, her voice shaky. After hanging up, she felt her gaze involuntarily drawn to her study door, as if she could see through the wood to the velvet box that contained the amulet. Her heart pounded in her chest, the beat echoing in her ears like an ominous drum. "Is everything okay?" Mark called from the kitchen, concern threading his voice. Anne hesitated before forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Yes, just some shocking news from work. Nothing I can't handle." "All right," Mark sighed, sounding unconvinced. "Let me know if you want to talk." Anne nodded, grateful for the normalcy he offered, but burdened by a growing dread she could not articulate. As she made her way to the bathroom and caught her reflection in the hallway mirror, she looked the same, yet irrevocably different. In the depths of her eyes, a subtle change whispered secrets she was afraid to know. As she began her morning routine, Anne told herself that Mr. Thompson's death was a tragic coincidence, completely unrelated to her whispered wish the night before. And yet, as she brushed her teeth, washed her face, and looked into the mirror one more time, she felt an unsettling certainty settle over her. She had woken something powerful and perhaps malevolent. It rested in the velvet box, on her study desk, an enigma wrapped in dread and mystery. A quiet, implacable voice in the back of her mind whispered that her life had veered onto an unfathomable path, and whatever lay ahead, there was no turning back. Anne's workplace had always been a realm of order and predictability, its cubicles and conference rooms forming a familiar labyrinth that had grown comfortable over the years. But now, the beige walls and hum of fluorescent lights felt like a menacing backdrop to the high-stakes drama unfolding in her life. As she sat at her desk, her thoughts drifted to the amulet, its presence like a dark moon pulling at the tide of her sanity. The chatter of her colleagues seemed to blur into a monotonous drone, punctuated only by occasional bursts of laughter or the shrill ring of a phone. Michelle, still reeling from Mr. Thompson's mysterious death, passed by Anne's cubicle. "I still can't believe it, Anne. It's like we're in some sort of horror movie. Life can be stranger than fiction," Anne replied, her voice tinged with an irony she hoped Michelle wouldn't detect. leaving work early, Anne decided to pay a visit to Sarah, her closest friend and confidante. Sarah lived in a modest but charming house adorned with colorful wind chimes and fragrant flower beds. Whenever Anne visited, the aroma of blooming jasmine and lavender would greet her like a fragrant embrace. It was a haven that felt far removed from her present turmoil. Sarah, a vivacious woman with a perpetually optimistic outlook, welcomed Anne into her living room. The atmosphere was light and airy, the space adorned with bohemian tapestries and filled with the soothing melodies of soft jazz emanating from a vintage record player. "So good to see you, Anne. You've been a ghost these past few days. What's going on?" Sarah asked, handing her a cup of steaming herbal tea. "Life's just been a bit complicated," Anne confessed, pausing as she chose her words carefully. "Sarah, if you could wish for anything, what would it be?" Sarah chuckled. "Oh, you know me. Always a romantic. I guess I'd wish for love. Someone who truly understands and appreciates me, quirks and all." Anne smiled, her fingers nervously circling the rim of her teacup. "Well, here's to wishes that come true," she said, raising her cup in a toast they both acknowledged with a sip. Later, as Anne left Sarah's home, enveloped by the dusky twilight, she found her thoughts consumed by the amulet's relentless allure. Was it possible? Could she harness its power for something good? Almost in a trance, she whispered to herself, "I wish for Sarah to find true love." The next day arrived with a text message that made Anne's heart sink into the abyss. It was from Sarah's brother. "Sarah is gone. Freak accident. Gas leak at her place last night. No words to describe how shattered we are. We'll let you know about the funeral arrangements." Anne's phone slipped from her trembling hands, clattering on the floor as a cold numbness enveloped her. The room swayed, walls closing in like the jaws of some malevolent beast, as the ghastly realization descended upon her. She had done this. The amulet, her whispered wishes, they weren't just coincidences or accidents. They were lethal transactions, souls bartered for desires spoken in the dark. Frantic, Anne raced to her study. She had to lock the amulet away, bury it, do something to prevent its malevolent power from wreaking more havoc. Her hand trembled as she picked up the velvet box and opened it. The amulet seemed to glimmer with an unnatural light, almost as if gloating over its victories. With newfound resolve, Anne locked the box in a small safe hidden at the back of her closet, spinning the dial to seal it away. She backed away, feeling as if she had momentarily caged a predatory beast. Just as she was about to leave the room, a voice, soft and insidious, slithered into her ears. And it whispered, a murmur that seemed to emanate from the very walls, a voice tinged with a blend of mockery and anticipation. She stared at the safe, her blood running cold. Despite the barriers of steel and lock, the amulet was calling to her. It knew her name, and it wasn't done with her yet. The public library in Anne's town was an aging edifice, a sanctuary of knowledge whose musty odor bore the weight of years and countless secrets. Light filtered through stained glass windows, casting geometric rainbows on worn-out carpet and towering bookshelves. Anne felt like she was walking through an intellectual cathedral, each aisle a different nave dedicated to various disciplines and philosophies. Today, her search was singular and ominous, tomes on the occult and demonic lore. She leafed through age-yellowed pages, her fingers tracing arcane symbols and ancient scripts, her eyes scanning texts that spoke of malevolent spirits and cursed objects. Each paragraph she consumed heightened her sense of urgency and dread. Finally, her eyes landed on an obscure passage about entities known as soul collectors. The text mentioned experts in demonology, and one name stood out. Father Williams, a priest rumored to possess extensive knowledge in battling demonic forces. Anne found Father Williams in an old, stone church that had seen better days. The interior was dimly lit, suffused with the scent of incense, and the quiet reverence that imbues such sacred places. A vaulted ceiling soared overhead, but instead of feeling liberated, Anne felt dwarfed, as if the weight of her newfound knowledge made her a mere speck in the universe's grand design. Father Williams was an elderly man with piercing blue eyes that contrasted his graying hair, and deep lines etched into his face. Despite his age, there was a vigor to him, an unspoken authority. He listened patiently as Anne recounted her tale, his expression grave, and when she finished, he sighed heavily. "What you possess, my child, is no ordinary amulet. It houses a soul collector, a demonic entity that trades mortal desires for souls," he explained. Anne gripped the edge of the pew. How can I be rid of it? Please, I've done terrible things without knowing. Ah, knowledge is the first step to absolution, he replied. To be free of the amulet, you must willingly give it away. Yet, understand this, it will demand a final soul as a parting gift. Anne felt a chill sweep over her, colder than the marble statues lining the nave. A final soul. Whose? Father Williams met her eyes, and in that moment, Anne saw in him a well of sorrow and wisdom that unnerved her. Yours, Anne. The demon will demand yours. Upon returning home, Anne felt like she was in a waking nightmare, each step toward her house tinged with an indescribable dread. When she crossed the threshold, she realized her home no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a battleground. She was haunted by Father William's words as she ascended the stairs to her study. The amulet, locked away yet far from powerless, seemed to emanate an aura that infiltrated her thoughts, filling her with both terror and regret. She sat down at her desk, her eyes falling on family photos that now seemed like relics from a lifetime ago. How had she allowed her life to veer so sharply into darkness? Suddenly, the words of Father Williams resonated in her ears. It will demand a final soul as a parting gift. Her own soul. The realization bore into her like a gnawing, incessant ache, amplifying with each passing second. The room grew darker, the air denser. A whisper seemed to emanate from the walls, a sinister laugh without a source, and Anne understood it was a laughter not of this world, but from the shadowy realm of the soul collector. For the first time, Anne felt the magnitude of her plight. She was tethered to a demonic entity, locked in a struggle she had no idea how to win. As fear and dread enveloped her, she knew one thing with aching clarity. Her soul was the final piece in a malevolent puzzle, and time was running out. Anne's home felt like an impenetrable fortress of dread. The walls seemed to close in on her, and each tick of the clock was a drumbeat in a symphony of impending doom. Grasping the accursed amulet tightly in her gloved hand, she drove to the outskirts of town. A secluded forest lay ahead, its dense canopy casting shadows even in daylight, as though the trees whispered secrets in a language too ancient for mankind to comprehend. Her first idea was simple: give the amulet away. With her heart pounding, Anne approached a wanderer, a man whose eyes told stories of a lifetime of hardship. She hesitated, then stretched out her hand, offering the amulet. Please, take this. I think it may bring you good fortune. The man eyed it skeptically, but took it nonetheless. Anne turned around, her heart momentarily buoyant. Had she finally escaped its cruel grasp? As she reached her car, her hand instinctively went to the glove compartment, and there it was. The amulet had returned. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't just a talisman, it was an unyielding, malevolent force. Her second idea was a burial, perhaps in the heart of the forest, or casting it into a river whose currents would carry it far away. But even as these thoughts crossed her mind, the amulet seemed to pulse, as if in anger. A voice, guttural and unearthly, filled the car, originating from nowhere and everywhere. Don't even think about it, Anne. Terrified, she sped back home. Her last hope was Mark, her husband. If anyone would believe her, surely it would be him. Mark, we need to talk, Anne said nervously as they sat in their living room that evening. The room was well lit, warm, decorated with mementos of their life together. Yet the familiar setting did nothing to ease Anne's burgeoning sense of dread. What's troubling you? Mark inquired, his face a portrait of concern. Taking a deep breath, Anne explained everything. The mysterious shop, the whispers of desire, the untimely deaths, and her meeting with Father Williams. She expected disbelief, maybe even laughter. Instead, Mark's eyes narrowed. Anne, have you been taking those sleeping pills again? Mixing them with wine? He asked, suspicion clouding his face. Mark, I'm not delusional. I wish I were. Anne protested. Mark's gaze shifted, and Anne followed it. There on the coffee table was a bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and an open container of sleeping pills. She looked back at Mark, then at the table, utterly bewildered. I didn't put those there. She caught a glint in the room, a shimmer in the air. The amulet was changing her reality, sabotaging her last chance at confiding in someone. Look, Anne, maybe you need to see someone. Professionally, Mark said cautiously, his words etched with disappointment. Frustration welled up inside Anne. She wanted to shout, to convince him, but what was the use? With her reality bending around her, how could she convince anyone of the unbelievable truth? That night, as Anne lay in bed staring into the darkness, she heard it again. the voice. But this time, it was unequivocal, leaving no room for doubt or denial. And it growled, each syllable a twisting knife of menace. Your soul will complete the circle. Your soul will be mine. The voice was neither human nor entirely inhuman. It was a cataclysm of worlds, a coalescence of nightmares. It was a soul collector, and it was calling in its final debt. As the darkness of the room seemed to deepen, Anne felt herself unraveling. Her hope, her sanity, her very soul now teetering on the edge of an abyss. Anne's home no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a haunted maze, each room echoing with the malevolent voice of the amulet. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the artifact, its surface cool and slick like the scales of some predatory creature. With a resolve born from desperation, she clenched it in her hand and whispered, "Show yourself." The walls of her room seemed to ripple, the colors draining away as if reality itself were being bleached. In an instant, Anne found herself in another place, neither dream nor reality. The air was thick with an eternal twilight, a grayish hue painting an expanse that defied description. Here, she stood on the edge of an abyss, a yawning chasm filled with swirling mist. In front of her floated a legion of souls, their ethereal forms pulsating in shades of light and shadow. Their faces were contorted, forever trapped in their last moment of earthly despair. The sight was a soul-crushing panorama, a grim tapestry woven from threads of infinite sorrow. "Welcome," the voice cooed, its presence permeating the atmosphere. It felt as though the very air had grown fangs. "This is my realm, and a monument to eternal agony. Soon, your soul will join these lost wretches." Desperation sharpened Anne's mind. Her eyes flicked to each soul, remembering Father William's teachings. A demon could be outwitted, but one had to be both clever and bold. "You claim to own these souls, yet what about your own?" she asked, her voice tinged with defiance. A low growl echoed in response. "I am a soul collector, a demon. I have no soul." "Ah," Anne replied, "then you admit you have no soul to collect." The realm seemed to quake, as though its very foundation were rocked by the demon's realization. A roar of unspeakable rage reverberated throughout, shaking the chasm and sending ripples through the imprisoned souls. "I've tricked you," undeclared, "and by your own admission, your collection is invalid." With that, a shockwave of energy burst forth from Anne, cascading through the realm. The legion of souls began to glow brighter, their shapes turning radiant before scattering like embers in the wind, ascending to realms unknown. The demon screamed a wail of ultimate defeat, its form disintegrating into tendrils of smoke and shadow that were swallowed by the chasm below. Anne's eyes snapped open. She was back in her bedroom, the first rays of dawn peeking through the curtains. Trembling, she looked at her bedside table. The amulet lay there, but it was shattered, its pieces scattered like the remnants of a malevolent dream. She touched the shards cautiously. They were now mundane, stripped of dark purpose. Yet, Anne knew she could never be the same. She was free, but the memory of the souls she'd inadvertently damned, and then saved, would haunt her forever. And though the dawn heralded a new day, within her remained a permanent dusk, a solemn reminder of her journey to the precipice of eternal despair and back. She swept the shattered amulet into a cloth bag, took it to her backyard, and buried it, marking the spot with a small, unassuming stone. No words were spoken, but her silence was a eulogy for the lost souls and a quiet vow to herself. From that point on, Anne would tread lightly between the realms of desire and consequence, forever aware that even a whisper could echo through eternity. Ah, you've made it to the end, dear listeners. A journey through terror and temptation, where the price of desire was almost too unbearable to witness. The question remains, what would you have done if you were in Anne's shoes? Perhaps some questions are best left unanswered. Remember, in our world or another, tread lightly, for even a whisper can echo through eternity. This is our Scary Stories, signing off for tonight.